Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how to do quilt in the hoop with fast frames. If you're not familiar with fast frames is a system for embroidery machines. The first piece of the system is this piece. You put this in your embroidery machine in place of your large embroidery hoop. And this allows you then to use the frames that come with the system, different sizes of frames, and they simply just lock in and you screw this down. And it comes with all kinds of different sizes. And typically you would use an adhesive stabilizer that sticks to the fast frames. But when you're doing quilting, this isn't water soluble. And when you're doing quilting, you want something that's water soluble or something that'll make the quilt fluffy and not stiff. And I find that this sticky stabilizer is too stiff for quilting. I like to use water soluble stabilizer for quilting. So the fast frames comes in a bunch of different sizes. I'm assuming in this video that you are familiar with fast frames and you know how to center your frame. One of the things that you need to be careful with fast frames, since your machine will assume that you have the large embroidery hoop for your machine, you can stitch all the way out here. The problem with that is if you do have a smaller frame in your fast frames hoop here, you could hit the edge of this and break your machine or your needle at the minimum. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with how to center your frames. There are all kinds of videos on how to do that. This is not the video that will show you how to do that, but the first step in anything that I'm going to show you after is putting your frame into your machine and centering the frame that you're going to use. The frame that I'm showing you today is the 7.5 by 7.5 frame. The quilt block that I will be demonstrating will create a quilt block embroidered area of 7 by 7. Now I do create all my own embroidery patterns, so I digitize them with everything that I want to be in that pattern. So I know, because I've created the pattern, that it'll fit perfectly in this frame. So you'll want to make sure that you, whatever pattern you're using, that you're making sure that it'll fit inside the frame that you choose. What I'm going to be showing you today is this pattern. So this is a pattern that I created. I'm creating a vintage look beetle quilt. So I'm using all beetle patterns. All bee pattern for my beetles. So a little pun there, but this is the pattern that I'll be showing you today. Like I said, I did create this pattern, digitize it myself, so I know all the stop and start points. So you'll want to make sure you're familiar with your pattern that you're using if you don't create it yourself. Also, in the pattern, I work in the quilting part or the stippling part, and it's kind of hard to see. So I'm going to flip it over here and you'll see the stippling. The layers that I'll be using is my top fabric, my quilting or batting fabric, and then a water-soluble stabilizer on the back. Now, I'm not doing the backing of the quilt at this time. I will show you in another video how to then piece this all together. But for the sake of what I'll show you today, we are not putting any type of backing. The reason why I don't prefer to do my backing is because when you're working with a embroidery machine, I don't care. I mean, I have a very high-end baby lock embroidery machine. You always get these snarls. It's almost impossible when you're doing machine embroidery to avoid these snarls that show up on the back. And if you're doing your backing fabric, all of those little bird's nest snarls, whatever you want to call them, will be on your backing. So that's why I do the backing separately. I always pre-cut my fabrics ahead of time. The worst part of cutting fabric, or I'm sorry, of quilting, is cutting fabric. So I always just take a day and cut all my pieces. So this is the stabilizer that I'll be using. This is cut to 9 by 9.5. And this will fit on the back of this frame, and I'll show you that in just a moment. My batting I cut to 9 by 9. And then my top fabric I cut 9 by 9. So the stabilizer fabric is a little bit larger, 9 by 9.5. So first thing you'll want to do is attach your stabilizer. And you'll need some tools to do that. So everything that I'll show you today, you're going to need several tools. First tool that you'll need is these little binder clips. This is what you're going to use to adhere to your machine or your frame. So you can see these are just those little cheap binder clips that you can get. And you're going to need a total of 12 of them, 4 for each side. Then you'll also need just some plain old Scotch tape. So just the kind of tape that you wrap presents with. So just plain old Scotch tape. You're also going to need some pins. I use the pins on the corners if I have a fabric that rolls up. So if you're using a stiffer fabric where the corners will roll up, you might want to use just some regular old straight pins. Also, basting adhesive. This stuff is super expensive. It's like $20 for this can. This is the kind that I like the most. It doesn't seem to gum up my needles as bad, and it does hold very nicely. So I use this very sparingly because it is expensive, and I typically will only buy this when it's on sale or I have a coupon, because if you just buy it outright, it is $20 for a bottle or a can. And it does wash away. Once you use it for your piecing, it washes away. So you definitely want to make sure that you get some form of this, whichever you prefer, if you have a preference, or I would recommend this style. You also want to use some embroidery scissors. These ones, they come with an end or a large applique, I should say, not embroidery, applique scissors. They come with a large side, and you'll see how that works in just a little bit. And then also these curved scissors make it really nice for applique. So I'm doing an applique quilt pattern, so I need these applique scissors. If you're not including applique in your quilting, then you would not need these. And then finally, just some regular scissors for cutting. Now, when you do your cutting out of your squares, obviously you'll use a rotary cutter and a roller of some sort. So I'm not going to show you that whole process at this time, but you will definitely want to use this to cut your blocks out. And then also just some regular iron-on type of stabilizer. I use this for my applique part. So again, if you're not using applique, you don't need to use this, but this demonstration will include applique, so you will need this. And don't throw away your little scraps, because if you do a lot of applique, you will find you'll have little pieces where these little scraps come in handy. So don't throw away your little scraps of fabric or of stabilizer, because they can come in useful for applique. So first off, we will attach the stabilizer to the frame. Now you'll notice when you use the stick-on stabilizer, it leaves this gunkiness on the edges of your frame. A lot of people will scrape this off, wash this off, soak their frames. I leave it on because it seems to help hold when I'm clipping on stabilizer, like I'll show you here. It does help to keep it in place. So I do not scrape this off, wash this off. I mean, if they get really, really super thick, I will take my fingernail and scrape it off. But I leave it on because it does help secure it. It gives some tension to it so it's not so slippery when I'm doing these types of clip-on stabilizers. So you'll just lay your frame on top of your stabilizer, and there's a long side and a short side. So your long side is going to be the width of your frame. The short side will be the height of your frame, because remember we cut the stabilizer 9 by 9.5. Now there's a groove here on the frame. Hopefully you can see that there, and I just kind of look at that and give a little extra on the edge of the stabilizer and just center it the best you can. Doesn't have to be perfect. Don't pull out your ruler or anything like that. Just has to be close. Then I'll take the clips and I'm going to start clipping it, 4 on each side. So I'm just going to clip this onto my frame. And also you'll notice on my fast frames I mark the center point. The height center points are already grooved into the metal, but the width ones aren't. So I mark them with a Sharpie. If you have to center your fast frame, these are the marks that you would use to get your cross points to then center your frame before you begin. So I just tend to mark them with Sharpie or a permanent marker so I can see them when I'm lining them up. Once I have one side done, I'm going to do the other side, and when I do this side, I'm going to give it a pretty good tug because I want this to be tight. So with me leaving this here, it makes the surface not very slippery, so it does hold very well. So I'm just going to keep this nice and tight and put my clips on. Alright, so I've got the width sides done. Now I need to do the height sides, and I don't want to pull this yet because there's nothing securing on this side, and this side you can't put clips on, obviously. So this is where the Scotch tape comes in. So I'm going to pull first the center. So I just push on the Scotch tape, give it a good push on the stabilizer. I pull the stabilizer, don't pull the Scotch tape because it will just pull right off of your stabilizer. So you just want to pull the stabilizer and then use your finger and push this down onto your frame. And I usually do 3 pieces. I'm kind of a creature of habit. And so every time I do that. Now you want to be careful too not to cover up your holes here too much. Those holes lock into your frame that you use on your machine. So these little nubs here, these holes lock in there, so you don't want to cover those up because that does have to lock in there. But if you get a little bit on there, it doesn't hurt it. And then finally my third piece here, so I'm just going to push that onto the stabilizer and then pull the stabilizer tight and push it down on the frame so that that's nice and secure. Alright, now I'm going to do the last side. Now that I have that tight with the tape, I can then pull this side. And again, just 4 clips on each side, so we'll do 4 here. And I'm pulling pretty tight, so you'll find as long as you're leaving that gunk, if you will, from your sticky adhesive or sticky stabilizer on there, it'll hold pretty darn tight. So it does give a nice tension to it. Alright, so I've got all 4 here. And at this point, if I do need to center my hoop, I would get a ruler and mark my crosshairs and then go to my machine and center it. Now, if you do find you've got a little give here, like you'll see I do here, you can always just come back around and tighten that up. You just want it as tight as you can possibly get it, but don't rip it. But just get it pretty secure. This stabilizer, by the way, that I'm using, this is Pellin 541 Wash and Gone, so it's water soluble embroidery non-woven stabilizer. So that's what this is that I'm using for my base stabilizer here. You can get that pretty much at any fabric store location. Now if you have any hanging over here, sometimes when you're getting really close to the edge here, it might get stuck under there. It's not a big deal because it does wash away, but I'm a little bit OCD and I like to kind of just nip that off a little bit to get it out of my way if it's too long. So I do pull that off a little bit just to get it out of my way. Okay. So now we have this. I mean, this is pretty tight. You can hear it's pretty taut there. So now I need to place my quilt batting and then my top fabric. So the first thing you'll want to do is just take and lay the fabric or the batting on the frame, and I just eyeball it. I just look to make sure I have pretty much the same amount overhang from this side and the same amount overhang on this side. So just laying it down there, and then this is where the spray baste comes in. Once I have it centered pretty well so it looks like I have the same amount of overhang here and the same amount of overhang here, just flip back half of it. And again, I'm pretty conservative with the spray base because it is so expensive. So I just spray it lightly, let it dry for a moment, and then roll the batting back over on top of your frame. And then flip it around and do the same thing on the other side. Let that dry a moment, and then roll it back on. Okay, so now we've got our batting placed, and I mean that's on there pretty good. It's secure, it's not sliding, and that's what we want. When it's not going to be super glued to it, but it's not sliding. Now for the fabric I'm using stripes, and I want to make sure that my stripes are centered. So I'm going to use pins to mark my center. So I just roll back the batting a little bit, find my center here, so that I can then center my fabric nicely on my hoop. And I'm going to find the little dip here and just mark that. Alright, now I'm going to take my fabric and I'm going to line up that pin and this pin just so I know that it's centered closely. I mean, nobody's getting out a ruler and measuring my quilts. If they do, that's their problem, not mine. But I just like to have it at least a little bit center. So you'll see that I have this now. It looks like I have quite a bit of edge. I'm using actually, this is mattress and pillow ticking because I want a retro look and feel, and I'm using also upcycled denim in my quilt as well. So this tends to, because it is not a tight wove, it tends to have a little bit of variation to it, if you will. So I might just move this over here to here and move this here so that we get a little more on this side. But that's pretty good there. So I've made sure my line, and now again, same that I did with the batting. I'm going to roll back half, spray with a little bit of spray based, let it dry for a moment, roll my fabric back, and then switch it around and do the same thing again. And then roll that back and have it nice and secure here. Okay, so now I'm ready to take this to the machine. The first thing, I'm going to pull these pins out also. Now, as I said earlier, if you have a fabric that's rolling up, I know when I do upcycled denim, a lot of times the denim will roll a lot. You can just always take a pin and kind of pin the corners if you're worried about them rolling up while you're embroidering. That's totally up to you. Just use your own judgment on that. Just make sure when you do pin, you're pinning outside of the embroidery location, because you don't want your embroidery machine needle to hit that. The first step it will stitch is the outline. So this will stitch the outline of this first piece of applique, so the large piece. So that will be the first thing that my embroidery machine will stitch, and then we will come back here and I'll show you how to place that. Okay, now we have the large outline of our applique stitched, so now we need to add our fabric. So this is where the iron-on stabilizer or interfacing, again, this is just what you can buy at a normal store, usable mid-weight iron-on interfacing. So I'm going to cut a little piece of this for my applique. So what I'll do, because I don't like to waste anything, is I just lay it on top of my frame. Kind of, you can see through it, see where your outline is. And then I take my scissors and I just cut around where my outline is. This aside. Now I have the outline of my applique piece here, and you can kind of refine it and get it to close to the size that you want. And then you're going to pick out your base fabric. And the nice thing about doing it this way, cutting your interfacing piece or your iron-on piece first, is if you have a fabric that has a design on it, you can then use this to figure out where you want to place your design. So it's kind of nice with anything that is maybe directional, has a top and a bottom. This fabric clearly is very random, doesn't have a top or a bottom. And doesn't have any particular design that I want to center. So I'm just going to lay my piece on here and figure out, you know, where you can lay it to get the less waste, or the least waste, I should say. And as you're, I'm sure, aware, iron-on has a top and a bottom. So this is the dotty iron-on side here. This is the smooth side, so I'm putting the dotty iron-on side down toward my fabric. And then grab my scissors and I cut around, pretty close, because I cut the interfacing, the iron-on piece. I left some room around it for the line so that I didn't get too short, so I can cut the fabric pretty close because I already have some play there on the iron-on piece. So just cut it close, and now I'm going to take this over and iron it. Okay, so I've ironed the stabilizer interfacing onto the back of my fabric, so now I'm going to place it back on my applique piece, and I can feel with my fingers where that line is, so I want to make this nice and centered there, and you know, move it up or down depending on where it needs to be. And then once you have it placed where you like it, I add a touch of spray baste to it just to hold it in place. So again, spray just a tab, let it dry for a second, lay it down, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So now we have it nice and secure there. So I'm going to take this back over to my machine, and it's going to stitch the same line again. And what that's going to do is give me the line of where I need to trim. So I'll be right back. Go to my machine. Okay, so I have stitched the outline of my piece, and then it's also stitched the placement of my next pieces of applique. At this time, if you want, you can go ahead and cut around the outside of this, but I'm going to place the remaining pieces of my applique, and then I'm going to cut them all at once. So this is where the small pieces come into play, because you see how small these are. This is perfect for these little extra pieces of interfacing that you end up with when you do applique or any making of any type of garment. You always end up with these little tiny pieces left over. So that's where I use these. So this one piece will fit onto the window here. So I don't like waste, so I try to use the pieces that would fit the most and use up the most of the scrap. So I think this one will fit okay, so I'm going to trim around it. That one's close, but I think I can make it work. And then finally the other little piece. So I know that one fits, so I'm just going to do this to get me my second one. Okay, so now I have all my little pieces, and all of my headlights I'm making gray, so I've already got this little scrap piece of fabric for my gray headlights. I'm just going to place them on here and iron them. And then for this, I'm using this really cool honeycomb pattern. So just going to put this on here and cut this out. Get as close as I can, and I'll iron these on. Okay. And then usually what I'll do is just trim my fabric around it so I know where my piece is. Alright. So now I'll place this on, just making sure that I'm covering everything I need to cover with that outline so I can feel around, feels okay. Now for these smaller pieces, it's kind of hard to lift and spray. So what you can also do is I just have an old envelope here that I'm using. And once it gets kind of sticky, you can push them on there. And then I just hit them real quick with the spray-based. That feels pretty good there. Let's get it centered on there. Centered there. And then again, I'll go back to my machine and it's going to tack down these pieces for me and give me my cut lines. Okay, And now that we are done doing the outsides of my smaller applique pieces, I can go ahead and cut out around the trace or the cut lines. So when I'm doing larger areas like this, I tend to use these larger applique scissors that have this flat side on it. And what's nice about this is when you are using them, you can slip that in there really nice. So I can pull this up, and you just want to pull it, and you don't risk cutting your backing fabric. So that's where these come in handy. And it's just up to you what your preference is. But these do work really nice for larger applique pieces. I would not use them on small applique pieces, but they do come in handy for large ones. These I use for the smaller pieces. Those are just way too large. So these have a nice curve to them, and you can get in there, and hopefully you can see this on here. Just get in there and cut around those pieces. Now in the pattern that I'm showing today, there aren't any satin stitches. I use the blanket stitch on this pattern because I do want it to look kind of old-fashioned and retro. So you'll notice in my sample here, a lot of applique will have a satin stitch that goes around the edges, where this one does not. I just have the blanket stitch because I just think that looks a little more old-timey, if you will. So I have to be pretty careful when I cut this around that I get pretty close. If you're using a pattern that has a satin stitch, you don't have to be so precise with your cutting around your pieces. But since I'm doing one where the edge kind of shows, I'm being a little more precise with my cutting here. But once you wash it, especially with a blanket stitch, this edge, because it is tacked down pretty well, but this edge will kind of wash up and kind of go away anyhow. So you don't have to be 100% exact, but you want to get as close as you can there. So you'll see I'm cutting a little more precise than you would have to with something that has a satin stitch in it. So just keep that in mind. What kind of stitching you're doing at the end will determine how precise your cutting around your applique pieces needs to be. Now the reason why I like this quilting in the hoop method so much is because I absolutely hate hooping fabric. And I always seem to get it off-centered. I never get it lined up, and it'll look like it's lined up. And once I push the two pieces of the hoop together to lock it in place, it'll run offline and run off center. So I like the fast frames. If I can figure out a way to use the fast frames for everything, I do, just because it is so much easier. Now you'll see as I'm cutting this, I'm cutting my tack down just a little bit. That's not going to hurt anything, because if you're doing a pattern with a satin stitch, it's going to cover it up anyhow. And my blanket stitch pattern that I'm doing, that stitch will lock it down again. So not a big deal if you nip into that first little stitch down cut line, if you will. I call it the cut line. The cut line stitch, it doesn't really hurt it at this point because you are going to go back over it. So just be careful you don't cut into your design where it's not going to be covered up. You want to make sure that you're not doing something like that. Okay, there we go. We have all of our applique pieces cut out. So now we just need to cut our, or stitch our detail pieces. So I'm going to go back to the machine. It's going to do this blanket stitch. It's going to stitch all of the wheels and the bumper, and the hood design on this applique. So we'll go back to the machine. Okay, so now we've stitched all of the detail stitching, the blanket stitching around, secured the applique down. So the next thing that we'll stitch is the quilting, so the actual quilting itself. So on my quilting, you'll see here, I have a matching thread so it blends real nicely. It's probably kind of hard to see on camera, but I have the quilting built in there. And my quilting actually has little Volkswagen Beetles on it. I restore and build classic Beetles. Beetles are my obsession, so therefore everything I do, I make is Volkswagen related in some way. So I'm going to now do the quilting stitches as well as the echo stitch around the applique. So you'll see that, I'll flip it over, you can see that echo stitch that'll go around the applique, and then also finally the outline stitch here. And so that's what I'll stitch next. Okay, so we have finished stitching the quilting, the echo, and also the outline border. So I can remove this from the hoop. So just pulling the clips off. now I have the tape along the top here, so I need to pull that, so just pull it forward. So from the front to the back of your hoop, and then I just simply pull it away and then grab the tape. And if you use a good Scotch tape, it usually comes off cleanly and doesn't stay on your hoop. Okay. Alright, so we've got it all removed from the hoop now, and the last thing that I do is I like to remove the extra wash away stabilizer. The way I look at it is the less that I have to wash away when I put the quilt together, the better. And it also, when I go to connect all these blocks, it just gives me less bulk when I do that. So I like to just get rid of all of those pieces. Now, if you have a use for these tiny little pieces, keep them. I typically don't have use for wash away that small pieces, so I throw them away. So you'll see I've got my quilting done, my outside border, and my echo stitch. So now this block is ready to eventually be turned into a quilt. And just to show you some of the others that I've done that will be part of this quilt, and I'll do another video when I go to connect them all. This is going to be upcycled with denim. So I also have cute little Volkswagen buses that I've made in the mattress ticking fabric, and then also denim because I love to upcycle denim, and I always have a full supply of denim because I have 3 sons and a husband who burn through denim like it's paper. So here's another denim of the front beetle, and then I also have a pattern for the rear of the beetle. And again, I'm doing all bee fabric because this is going to be my beetle quilt. So there are some of the other patterns. So I hope you found this video useful. I will be creating another one where I then take all of these squares that I make, and I'll show you how I connect these together and put the pieces in between to make the quilt, and also how to add the backing. You'll see here these are the pieces that I used to center, so they've got the lines marked on the back of them. Thank you so much for watching.